Tariffs are taxes. And if you want to really understand the power relationships within any economy at any particular period of time, look at the structure of the tax system. Look at who pays taxes and who doesn't pay taxes. That is, in a real time, a snapshot of the power relationship. That it changes over time.
Okay, good evening and welcome to the Charles River Museum of Industry and Innovation. I'm Steve Guerrero and I'm the Director of Education, and I have the honor of introducing tonight's speakers on a very timely topic. You know what they say, history doesn't repeat, but it's rhyming a lot lately. So we're here to talk about tariffs and trade then and now. We're gathered in a building that once powered the Boston Manufacturing Company, the first fully integrated textile factory in the world, founded by Francis Cabot Lowell in 1814. And this year is actually Francis Cabot Lowell's 250th birthday. So it was here that America's Industrial Revolution took root, reshaping not just manufacturing, but trade, labor, and economic policy. Francis Cabot Lowell understood that industry doesn't operate in isolation. It is shaped by government policy, global markets, and the flow of goods and capital. That's why in 1816, he traveled to Washington, D.C. to advocate for the first protectionist tariff in U.S. history. His success in securing trade protections helped launch an era of American manufacturing dominance. But as we know, tariffs and trade policy remain subjects of intense debate today, like literally today. Tonight's discussion will bridge past and present, exploring how economic policies of the early 19th century inform modern debates on tariffs, trade agreements, and globalization. We are honored to have two distinguished scholars with us. First, Professor Larry Peskin of Morgan State University is a historian specializing in antebellum political economy. His work on pro-manufacturing protectionism and American business history provides critical insights into the roots of U.S. trade policy. Professor Bryan Snyder of Bentley University is an economist whose work examines economic history, political economy, and ethics. As an educator and editor of Real World Micro and Real World Macro and Economics of the Environment, he brings a contemporary perspective to historical trade policies, helping us better understand their relevance in today's global economy. Please welcome Professor Larry Peskin.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you for coming here. It's a pleasure to talk about tariffs again. As usually when I talk about tariffs, it's been maybe a decade, and there's usually about 5 people around, so I don't know what happened. We have so many people interested in tariffs, but we'll make the best of it. I'm going to try to bring us up to 1816, actually, in about 20 minutes, so we'll see how that goes. And the myth of laissez-faire. So tariffs, I mean, it's not just that people were not interested in tariffs. I mean, tariffs were passé for a very long time. Classical economics and the Cold War in the 20th century led to a widespread belief in the connection between free markets and political freedom. In the United States, this fed a consensus that the American Revolution was about free trade as well as democracy. I won't speak on the latter, but as to the former, free trade, at least as it is understood today, free trade was really not a goal of the revolution. At best, the early United States could be considered free trade in the sense that merchants did not want their shipping trade to be controlled by other countries. Tariffs, which today are seen as anathema to free trade, or up until a few weeks ago are by contrast as American as apple pie, having been an important priority from the beginning of the Republic and even earlier. As most of you probably know, tariffs are traditionally divided into 2 categories. We have protective tariffs, and those are the ones we're most interested in here, I suppose. They're designed to protect domestic industry from foreign competition. So, you get the price of that Hyundai goes up, $10,000, and suddenly you're buying a Chevrolet. It protects American industry. And then the second type is revenue tariffs. Revenue tariffs are designed to raise revenue, not necessarily to restrict any sort of importation or to fiddle around with the manufacturing system. And Americans were protective in the colonial period, and that's a whole other story. But immediately following the American Revolution, the states, including very much Massachusetts, were extremely protective and regulatory in the sense of trying to play around with the economy rather than let the invisible hand do its magical work. But in Massachusetts, I mean, one of the most ironic things, it's not really protective legislation, but in 1785, the state legislature passed a Stamp Act. And if you know anything about the American Revolution, you might find it odd that Massachusetts would pass a Stamp Act, and that's very hands-on. In the states also, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and a number of others, almost immediately passed tariffs, which were in many senses protective. I mean, I've said that there's this dichotomy between protective and revenue tariffs, but it's hard, I think, for our economist friends to maybe determine where one begins and one ends. And I'll have a slide on this a little bit later on the details of these early state tariffs. And this is before the Constitution, so the states actually manage it. Pennsylvania, which was probably the most protective region at the time, explicitly said that their tariff was to encourage and protect the manufacturers of this state. So this is 1785, and they're setting these protective tariffs. Advocacy for this sort of protection, and you can read my book if you want a lot more than you probably need, but advocacy came from mostly small, what we would call mechanics today. I mean, the blacksmiths, silversmiths, these are pewterers, not big-time merchants or people with a lot of capital. And this was early on, the sense was that we're protecting like our artisans rather than a big institution like the one we're standing in today, or I'm standing, you're sitting. When this slide comes in with the American Revolution and the Constitution of 1787-89, and those same small producers who were supporting the state protection felt that the Constitution of 1789 would also protect them from foreign goods. And what the Constitution does, in part, is give the federal government the power, as we'll see in a moment, to lay all sorts of tariffs. And so they marched these mechanics in parades in Boston and New York and Philadelphia and all the major cities in support of the Constitution. And this is, I think, the only actual banner that survives from those parades. And if you read it closely, it talks about all arts will flourish under the Constitution and so on and so forth. And what they mean is that they'll protect us from these British and other European goods. That's why they supported the Constitution. So when we take a look at the Constitution explicitly allows for tariffs. I mean, that's one of the actually few ways of raising revenue that are specified by the Constitution. Here's the chapter and verse that talks about laying duties, imposts, and excises. Article 1, Section 8. And the only alternative, really, major alternative anyway, to tariffs is what they call direct taxes. And as you can see from this is, I think, a very little understood aspect of the Constitution. It allows for the laying of direct taxes, but they have to be apportioned among the several states, which means that the federal government would, decide like the state contribution. So it wouldn't really matter how many billionaires lived in New York. New York would have its contribution. This was never done, very briefly in 1798 and one or two other quick attempts. And the big problem for this, too, is right over here, where to determine the state contribution, you need to know the number of free persons plus 2/3 of those bound to slavery. I mean, this is much more famous in terms of representation, but it also was an issue with taxation. And as a result of this, 2/3, 3/5, as a result of this 3/5 clause here, this was hardly ever done because there was just so much debate over would the southern states have to actually contribute taxes based on the number of slaves they had. It was just a mess. Tariffs were much easier to implement. And the Constitution is very specific, actually, that no capitation or other direct tax shall be laid unless in proportion to the census. So there's no other way to do it. And just as a side note, all the talk of a wealth tax, the federal wealth tax, is very constitutionally dubious because of these stipulations in the Constitution about taxation. So that kind of left revenue tariffs as the main way of raising revenue for, I'm jumping ahead of myself probably, but for the next over 100 years and even further, and perhaps we will, I guess there's some talk of moving back to that today, so we'll see where that takes us. But anyway, the point is that all of this is baked very deeply into the Constitution and the early economy of the United States. I promised that we would, or threatened maybe, that we would have a slide about the protectionist tariffs here. The first tariffs, again, you can really argue, and our economist friends can, and perhaps Brian will, about what makes a tariff protectionist. But this table, on the left, we see the first federal tariff of 1789, and that's also very interesting because you can see the first thing, really, that Congress is doing almost after they become Congress is laying a tariff. And you can see that the percentages sort of range from about 5 to 10. It's very tricky because a lot of it is actually not percentages, but it's a dollar value per product, and that's pretty tricky to figure out what the percentage is. But these items are items where you can actually find percentages. You can also see that the early state tariffs, which were illegal after the Constitution, I mean, the states can no longer lay tariffs once you have the federal government. But you can see that they're actually, the Massachusetts tariff in particular, is quite a bit higher than the federal tariff. Well,
Massachusetts.
Well, if you could lay one today, I'm sure it would be up there. I mean, we can also see, we saw the flag for the pewterers, and you can see that, I mean, what's going on with them is, they're getting a pretty substantial tariff, so, they're pretty happy with the federal and the state governments before them. So we're not quite getting up to the 25% that we're talking about these days, but they're, pretty protective. There's a lot of political back and forth, I mean, as you would imagine, in terms of this. Most of the support, as I said, comes from smaller, mechanics like your pewterers. I mean, think of, a shop, really. I mean, 4 or 5 people. In the Mid-Atlantic, you are starting to see some small type factories, nothing like this, but, larger than a shop. So you're getting a transition to what we would think of as maybe modern day factories. And those people support the tariffs as well. But as I said, most of the protectionist support actually came from the Mid-Atlantic at this time, much more so than from Massachusetts and New England. In fact, in New England, the mantra was often free trade. New England was shipping, and the Federalists dominated New England at this time. And this is a campaign cartoon, I guess you would say, from the early 18 teens of Governor Strong. And I've got a close-up, but this is the ship of state, and the first flag you can see there, I've got a close-up here, is the Navy and free trade. And if you're a New England merchant, and those are the people that are running, certainly Massachusetts and much of New England, your real concern is that you don't want to be told where to ship your goods, and you don't want tariffs, taxation, any sort of impediment to the free movement of ships. So New England is not an early adapter for the most part of the tariff system, although you can see the Massachusetts tariff was protective, so there's back and forth going on here. The big change here in Massachusetts, and really the start of, I would say, this factory complex and New England manufacturing generally, came in 1808. In 1808, Thomas Jefferson, a free trader in many ways initially, laid the embargo of 1808, which is not a tariff, technically speaking, but what it was people concerned actually about shipping and the Napoleonic Wars and the British and the French interdicting American ships and impeding the free flow of transatlantic trade. So the embargo of 1808 was aimed as a great experiment by Jefferson to peaceably persuade the great powers of Europe to take their hands off American shipping by stopping all trade. So as of January 1st, 1808, the United States would no longer allow their ships to trade with the European powers and anybody else. So talk about a regulatory hands-on system. I mean, that's pretty much the opposite of the invisible hand as far as I can tell. And by the way, it was a big failure. This is a Massachusetts cartoon, and they're talking about this cursed "Oh grab me," which you can see is embargo backwards, and that became the the joke about the embargo. That it's the "Oh grab me," and it was terrible. It destroyed shipping for quite some time, especially in this region. But what it did was economics is all about unintended consequences. And the unintended consequence of having this embargo was that it acted as a protective mechanism. Since there was no overseas trade, at least legally speaking, it was a huge incentive to start building domestic manufacturing. Again, it wasn't intended that way, but that was an unintended consequence. It got repealed pretty quickly, and then there was a series of other sort of similar but less extreme legislation. And all that continued really until the War of 1812 came along a few years later. And the War of 1812, which my students love because it's easy to remember the date, went up to 1815. And during that whole period, you have protection, it acts as a protective tariff because we're not getting very many goods from Great Britain when we're involved in this warfare. And so that's really when the Boston Associates begins, when Francis Cabot Lowell gets active in terms of bringing European manufacturing, which he kind of stole, into the United States. And it's no coincidence, that this, it's no coincidence, right, that this whole complex was begun in that period. I mean, this is what's new in this period, and what's really new in New England, even though there were, as I said, there were small manufactories and medium-sized ones in the Mid-Atlantic, is the involvement of merchant capital. And so these New England merchants who, most of them, if they were smart, they just kind of withdrew from trade during this period, maybe a little smuggling here and there, but not too much. And so the capital, moved into complexes like this, which you can see they take a lot of capital. Having benefited from protection, whether intended or not, New England suddenly became very protectionist. We moved from free trade to protection. And not surprisingly perhaps, the people that really lobbied for protection were the people involved in this complex. People like Francis, what happened to, I thought I had Francis Cabot Lowell. No, there are no good pictures of Francis Cabot Lowell, are there? There's just a little silhouette, yeah, so I didn't use that. But Lowell was certainly involved. Abbott Lawrence, that's a name that probably doesn't need much explanation around here. Israel Thorndike, and many other so-called Boston Associates were the ones who were really behind the lobbying for industrial protection. And Daniel Webster, the great senator from, originally from New Hampshire, I want to say, but the Massachusetts senator, who had always been a free trader, also becomes a friend of protection, surprisingly, certainly by 1824. If not 1816, when the first major protectionist tariff goes through. And so these folks are all together lobbying Congress for protective tariffs in 1816, 1824, and then 1828 is kind of the big one. That's the Tariff of Abominations, which almost starts the Civil War, 40 years ahead of schedule. It's really hard to demonstrate the utility, at least I can't, demonstrate the utility of these tariffs, whether they helped the Boston Associates or whether they, were just immaterial. But clearly, the people who were behind these factories felt that they were important and that they were necessary for the development and protection of New England manufacturing. And they certainly never complained, as far as I can tell, that they violated free trade. In fact, that was the mantle that was taken up by Southerners who were involved in continent slavery and needed goods from Great Britain. So free trade moved south, protection reigns in this region for quite some time. And that takes us up to 1816. I hope I did it in time. But just to jump ahead 100 years in 2 minutes, tariffs after 1816, after 1828, they remained at the center of the American economy for a century and obviously for more, oscillating between protection and revenue, depending on who was in power and what the day was, and occupying, a really central place in the political dialogue that went on throughout the 19th century. Here's one of many cartoons. This is McKinley, who's much in the news today, and this is the 1890s, and you can see that high protection tariffs are still at the center of the discourse. The passage of the 16th Amendment in 1913 allowed for the income tax, which we are all familiar with these days, I hope. April is coming on. But even after 1913, tariffs, the Smoot-Hawley tariff and so forth, if you're familiar with the early 20th century, would really remain at the center of American dialogue and American political economy. So hopefully I brought you up into the 20th century or close to the 21st, and Brian can take it from there. So thank you very much.
Oh, bravo. Some thanks. First of all to Steve. Steve, the term prescient, talk about calling the shot. Okay, when we received the notification, it's like, damn, you got the eye. You called it. Because we have these, teachable moments, serendipity and synergism, where history comes together with events, and it's the perfect time. We have the perfect place to talk about this subject, okay? And because specifically, this is where the American Industrial Revolution starts. And if you want a poster child to basically give us this sort of the America, instead of the colonial, to build it into something more, it definitely is our friend Francis Cabot Lowell, okay? A remarkable person, and you're absolutely right, Steve. This dude needs to be studied because his life is remarkable. For my fellow economists here, he embodies a moment in time when you look at this nascent thing called economics, of this transition from a thinking in a mercantilist way to one where the wealth of a nation is in the value of production, not exchange. And he does this moment, the primitive accumulation of making the early bucks was in merchant capital. It was in those 8 boats shipping, from slaves and rum and around you go, that dirty little business. But it brought up the thing, but after that he realized that if America's gonna go anywhere, and in particularly the new men who are coming up through the merchant capital area, they need to start thinking about actually making stuff. And he takes 2 years away and visits merry old England, particularly actually Scotland, where he then, Lancaster, et cetera, in southern Scotland, spends 2 years doing industrial espionage. And this cannot be emphasized enough that the American ingenuity was first, let's borrow a bit. And it literally 2 years of cribbing notes and memorizing as much as possible. And then, the war breaks out, 1812, and the next thing you do is you head back here. But this was it, because they knew where the future was going. It was in production. And being able to then take the kinetics of water power, and then through the introduction of the steam engine, this is going to now drive a new form of production, which will start creating value, and value through production. England, the colonial giant of the time, had this absolute advantage in the production of textiles. And when you look here at where we were, we are a colonial colony. And we had a colonial economy as such, and it was not a free economy. This was a very controlled economy, in a lot of very visible hand. But in a colonial situation, if you look at the structure, it is one of dependency, that the dominant country will get the raw materials that they need, And they will also have a captive market of the value added. Now, this is for economists is a very important thing. If you're going to develop, you need to start engaging not in raw material exports, but in value added. And that comes through production. And so Lowell absolutely nails it when he comes here because he says this is the future. And this, most certainly it was. Now, the other thing, and this is when I view history, I view it dialectically. The tension between systemic forces in the growth of global capital and idiosyncratic forces as far as history's personalities and events. Okay? And there's always this tension here because the long game is the systemic growth. And the systemic growth is a growth of global capitalism. Moving away from these early colonial situations with carved out, colonies and the battles between these European capitals, et cetera. But also to remember that it's a curious proposition because if the nation state itself is going to be running interference, in a sense, and protecting these nascent capitalists. This is like in England, it was those integrated companies, the East India Company, the Atlantic Pacific companies. These were large integrated corporations. Actually, the power of the East India Company was massive. It actually outflanked the power of the British Navy. So this interesting relationship between national power, the national navy, and the economic power of these large integrated companies is what was dominating. Well, what do large integrated companies do is they had these exclusive economic zones. And they dump finished goods there in these captive markets, and you have to take it. Well, I mentioned that one of the most brilliant things of Francis Cabot Lowell is that not only the innovation, the tinkering, which tends to be, I guess, in American DNA, we're a nation of tinkerers. And he was tinkering with his rum, and the machinery when his rum factory, when he was in that particular business, but he was also interested in the mechanization of textile production. The fascinating thing about it is that he absolutely insisted on being able to set this particular thing up here, but the timing was problematic. Now, we know that we're going to, with a colonial economy, you're going to start dealing with the fact that we were deliberately underdeveloped under the colonial system. We did not have that manufacturing, the value added. This is extracted, and that's by design, because you can control a country if you can keep the people dependent as such. And we chafed against that massively, to our credit. And another one of our superpowers, not just as tinkerers, but we're also really remarkably good criminals, okay? We smuggle. And when we had a navy and we knew how to use it, fast boats. Oh my God. And so what wound up happening is that those Yankee clippers, those Yankee traders, were just that. And then when it came to having to deal with these overpriced goods being value-added being brought to our particular region, well, they were very, very expensive. We could get around that. Now, a little note, just technically, historically, the very physical thing about tariffs. People familiar with the law of the hammer, correct? If the only tool you know is a hammer, the whole world looks like a nail. You guys had that. It's tariffs, because that was the only tool available. Because when you take a look at revenue, that the only place to really be able to get that kind of chokehold, that location, was on the dock. So you had, because of the lack of any sort of formal state apparatus to collect taxes, you collected them on the dock. And so it was very historically quite specific. So therefore, for merchant capital, also the fact who had any money? Merchant capital. Because they were able to have significantly higher rates of profit than essentially the subsistence agriculture you saw within a colonial economy, especially in the Northeast and in New England, okay? Southern, you could have certain type of wealth being accumulated through the plantation economy. From the Northeast, it wasn't terribly lucrative or rich. So what you wound up having is, what was the Willie Sutton thing? Why do you rob banks? Well, that's where they keep the money. So if you need taxes on the revenue side, you got to figure out where is the money, and you catch them on the dock, because that's the chokehold. Once again, back to our propensity to smuggle. We just found other places to dock. okay? So we would avoid it. Now, one of the interesting things after our first tariff was then it immediately sort of got, because we chafed at that, and we got our own smuggling stuff. We started smuggling against our own particular institutions. We're just good at it, okay? Now, a note here. From someone, I mentioned that Lowell is the perfect embodiment of the transition from thinking along mercantile lines, the mercantilist lines, the bullionists, to those of the thinking of Adam Smith. Okay? At this time in England, in about 1812, a little bit further, was a chap named David Ricardo. And Ricardo was the preeminent British economist. He was in Parliament, and he was arguing against the Corn Laws, which is a series of tariffs prohibiting the importation of grain. And a distinction to be made here is fascinating, because they needed to increase the importation of grain because their crops were failing consistently. What wound up happening is that the failure of crops, English working men were starting to starve. Now remember, of course, they gave no two shits about the Irish starving. In fact, they encouraged this. But when it came to the fact of English working men starting to starve, things had to be done. And continued bad weather and bad harvests pressed the point. But the importation of raw grain from Wallachia in that particular region, this is a raw material. There's no value added here. And the point that Ricardo was making as far as why you should not engage in tariffs in this is because when you import that grain, it creates an efficiency, so now you can actually have your working men not starve, but it can have a downward pressure on wages because the grain's absolutely cheaper. The key here is the difference between importing a raw material or a tariff or prohibition and that of a finished good. We know to develop, we have to do a finished good. We have to do a value added, and that's exactly what we did. That tariff was there to allow for industry, value added to start to flourish, okay? All right. The embargo of 1807, Lawrence mentioned two things as far as tariffs. We can do it as a protectionist or we can do it as revenue. Practically, revenue was really the only place to really bring in that money. So that was already established. The protectionist is the interesting thing because this was viewing into the future about what would happen if you would flood the market with cheap finished goods as such, because scale economies. When you're just starting out, your costs are going to be higher. The British scale of these textiles was so significantly greater, they had an absolute advantage as far as the price of the textiles. Infant industry. We had an infant industry, and protection is there to basically give it time to grow, to quote, stand on its own 2 feet. Now, we've abused that over the years consistently, but there is something to it, because they could have basically smothered the child in the crib if they had dumped textiles or been allowed to. But back to serendipity and, more importantly, the idiosyncratic aspect of that wonderful embargo of 1807. Now remember, the English and the French, in that love fest they were having, decided to sort of, okay, they would stop American ships, the British in particular. And they were press ganging American sailors into the British Navy. And they were doing even nastier things to the Brits that they viewed to be deserters. They were killing them. Enough is enough. So you reach a point, and back to law of the hammer. If the only actual recourse you have to express your displeasure is to increase the price on the imports to exclude them, you do it. This Exclusion Act of the Embargo of 1807 gives you the War of 1812. Simple as that. And that war, lasting, 1815 up to 1816, that war is what winds up giving that space, that room, that forces this infant industry, this nascent industry, to start getting traction, to start taking off. It's an odd thing historically that when another country, a more powerful country, starts to control you and get you down, what you need to do is you need to basically just survive. And how you survive is you have to get your act together domestically. And we did this. One example of this currently, Take a look at embargoes, but more importantly, export controls and sanctions against the country of Iran. Those sanctions have actually created within the Iranian economy incredible resilience out of necessity. And we had to do that too. We were in a situation of war and of necessity, so we had to get our act together. But in doing so, we start the ball rolling and we start domestically being able to produce accordingly. Now, a note, the idea of this free trade. We are Yankee traders. Our ships are fast. We're nimble when it comes to being able to move through goods, etc. We spot an opportunity, we take it. Maybe morally indefensible opportunities as far as the slave trade, but we take it. Because this is it, we have to be. We have to be nimble, we have to jump on opportunities. Because we are a small economy. We are up against the largest bloody empire that world had seen up to that time. Are you aware how vulnerable this country was? So we had to act and we had to be very clever in what we were doing, okay? So this continues on and on and on. Into the antebellum South. Because of the reality of tariffs, we've always had this visible hand. And because of our relationship to the empire, to the British, I'm not sure why the French hated us, why we had this falling out, but we did, I guess. But so we had now our sugar daddy that helped us with the revolution. The French are now turning their backs on us, and the English just hate us. They're such bad losers. And are you slightly Irish? Just work that propensity. Okay. We had that thing, and this is part of our exposure. We trade, and we are very, very good at it. Very nimble going around the world, etc. And the British Navy would harass us, etc. We'd get pirates and what have you. We'd get bad times in North Africa. But we did this. And one of the things we were was this clarion call of free trade. We'll trade with anyone. We'll trade with anyone. Well, the fact is that domestically we're protecting, but as we're going around to other colonies, free trade, trade with us, trade with us, trade with us. Well, the whole thing about being a colonial power is that you don't, it's a controlled thing. You exclude them. And we kept doing that, trade with us, trade with us, trade with us, trade with us. Free trade. Come on, we'll compete with anybody. We got these new textile mills going on here. We got these cool things going on here. Trade with us, please, trade with us. Come on. It's cheap, it's better, it's new, we're Americans. We solve problems. Trade with us. Crickets. How we solved that problem was in the 1890s, finally. We went through the Civil War and we kind of pulled apart, et cetera, because the southern countries decided, well, the tariffs, they aren't really working for us, et cetera, and we still want to trade with England, and god awful bloody mess. But by the 1890s, we realized that going around and screaming, free trade, no one's listening. We have to play the old game. But by this time, we were now powerful. And there's a huge difference when it comes to trading relationships when you're powerful. Because it's not the prices, it's the terms of the exchange. And when it comes to power, a powerful country can manipulate the terms of the exchange. So how do we solve our problem in the 1890s? It's simple. We needed colonies. How do we get them? We mugged Spain, okay? They had it coming anyway, okay? They had it. So we got our colonies, per se. We had this, and we tried it. We even tried China, too, but it was already stolen on us, so we really couldn't even have a crack at China. Go up through the wars, etc. We're getting more and more powerful. Remember, this is ground zero of an industrial revolution. This goes off into metals, it goes into serious industry, because it turns out we're really good at this stuff. And we're so good, too, that we absorb the technical prowess of engineers all over the globe, from Germany, expat Brits. Anyone who's good with a wrench is coming here because the ceiling's high. So our industrial revolution was imported on people who said, I can go someplace in this country. And it worked. Coming out of the Second World War, remember, we said tariffs all big because this is the nature of the beast. There's no invisible hand. Now, we come out of the Second World War, and I don't know if you guys caught this, but we won. And when you win the war, you determine the terms of the peace. Pax Americana. And this was that moment where we said to the British, it's been real, but really. get stuffed, okay? We now can dominate the global trading relationships. We do it with petrodollars, we do it with exchange rates, World Bank, et cetera. Take a look at John Maynard Keynes and the Bretton Woods, specifically with the post-war structure of the economy. We didn't have the bank war, we had the US dollar eventually. So the dollarization of the global economy was really fantastic stuff. That's powerful. And out of this starts to creep this notion about, we can really start saying free trade. And it's wild because free trade as a motto happens when you're powerful. Because now it becomes a motto because you're doing anything but free trade. Because you're powerful. You already can control the terms of the trade, et cetera, and you're able to deal with this. And it continues up. Uruguay round of the GATT, General Agreement, Trade and Tariffs. You start further, and this is coming out of the ideology of economic theory. This is coming out of Ricardo, but also other folks who are getting their 2 cents in about the efficiencies of trade. Wouldn't it be lovely if we trade on comparative advantage? But all the time, we're still engaging in very visible hands. Well, it starts to shift. The WTO, the World Trade Organization. And this becomes it. Remember talking about moving from a colonial situation to the growth of colonial, then post-colonial type of situations, into now one of a true global system, sui generis, global capital in and of itself. And the idea here is that you use the nation state to protect the capital when it needs it. But there's this lovely little obscure quote from volume 3 of Capital from Marx. The idea that the nation state will use, the capitals will use the nation state as a crutch. And as soon as capital is powerful enough, as far as transnational capital, multinationals, et cetera, it no longer needs the state and can simply push it aside, drop the crutches, and walk free. So this is the notion that when you have a truly global capital system, capital in and of itself as a global system, the nation state is no longer necessary to provide the protection for global capital. So what winds up happening is that let capital be capital, neoliberalism. The idea of breaking down barriers. And this was it, from the Uruguay round of the GATT all the way through the WTO, et cetera, the breaking down of national barriers and allowing capital to be capital. Now, this is fascinating because what happens is that the nation state takes a back seat to the domination of markets and capital. The power relationship shifts. And this was a real thing. But after it was open, after the WTO came out and everyone signed on, they were sort of basically hustled into it, which is basically the same criteria you get if you're a country behind in your payments to the IMF. You get a structural adjustment program where you have to open up your economy, especially your financial sector and your insurance, to global capital. Now, a lot of developing countries, not just LDCs, but sort of the BRICS, the younger the wannabes as newly developing countries, they signed on to it because as Joan Robinson said way back in the day, that the only thing worse than being exploited by capital is to not be exploited by capital, okay? So signing on, they knew this might be a bumpy ride, but the cost of not signing on it was going to be even worse. So what winds up happening is everyone goes in, and there's a boom of expansion as globally capital starts to feel itself out. Fire, finance, insurance, real estate, areas that were protected because this is extremely important to development of certain countries, now gets cracked open, wide open, and there's a feeding frenzy. Global capital reasserts itself as such. But something happens. And it's even before the election of 2016. The high water mark of globalization, of neoliberal globalization, is already receding by the time of the 2016 election. So what gives? Is it that they ran out of loot? That all available opportunities were immediately snapped up with that feeding frenzy and there was really nothing left to steal? That's one thing. But there was also pushback from these countries saying, well, the results of this, okay, we appreciate you coming in and gobbling stuff off, but we have huge polarizations in income and wealth going on here. We don't control our country anymore. We have now arbitration boards to deal with disputes, and we no longer control our own labor, our environmental, and our own policies. That's not going to work. So there was a retrenchment already. The tide was going back out from this free trade neoliberal type of thing. And then we come in with the 2016 election. Well, what made the political side of tariffs so popular? Now, I hate to break it to you, but in this country, there's this place called, it's the flyover zone. You might have heard of it. It's called like the Midwest, the Rust Belt, places like Ohio, Michigan. There were real casualties as far as trade. But when you opened it up and you outsourced, there was a significant amount of people getting clobbered. Remember earlier on, we had things like NAFTA with our two trading partners, Canada and Mexico. And at first, this big boom is the capital's readjusting itself. Oh, yay, free trade. The Mexicans thought for a second we might even become middle class. Canadians, well, they're just Canadians. Now, with that said, what winds up happening is that you have the free trade agreement going on and on, but that's de facto recognizing the globalization of capital to begin with. The idea of tariffs is problematic when you have transnational corporations that have business in all three countries. Having to cross a border and pay a tariff is stupid because it's an inter-firm transfer. It distorts the trade figures. That's why we moved from GNP to GDP, because it has to acknowledge the integration globally of capital itself. That you might remember a company called Ford. I can remember once piling down the Autobahn way back in the day, and a compañera saying, do you have Fords in your country? And I said, I don't know. Do you have Mercedes in yours? But Ford has exposure in Mexico, Ford exposure in Canada, and the United States, in Europe. And every time a bumper crosses a border, it was treated as an import or an export. That didn't work. This is why we dropped GNP to GDP, to acknowledge this globalization. So take one step back and just think about it. That even though the ideology of free trade, and the efficiencies, et cetera, well, we don't really do that. The WTO says, okay, no tariffs, but we get around that. We do it on the front end through subsidies. The biggest beef that developing African countries have to Europe is the subsidization of EU agriculture. And if you really wanted to have a problem as far as immigration, et cetera, you would rectify that problem and start allowing these countries to be able to export agricultural products and keep the labor there, et cetera. But it doesn't. All right, so they used the free trade and they used the WTO to go on the shopping spree. They used it as a cudgel to open up other economies. But at the same time, the most powerful countries were still engaging in the subsidization of their own industries. So it's not a tariff on the back end, it's in the front, a change in the relative prices through subsidies as such. So the nation state is still engaged in the protection as such. You may not have the capital standing behind your skirt and tugging at it periodically. Capital might be out in front, but you're still offering assistance in the form of these particular subsidies. What happened in 2016 was the populism of screaming, we realize there are victims. It's not a win-win situation with trade. And you had a series of ill thought out and ill timed and ill targeted tariffs, okay? Stuff happens. I don't know how many of you caught the most recent rounds of tariffs, but what is that thing about doing the same thing and expecting different results over and over and over again? It's the very definition of madness, correct? Same bloody thing. And the idea is because it does sell, because there are people really hurting. And you can take a demagogue and you can work the stuff because it resonates. One of the problems when you're spouting, kind of the free trade and the globalization and how everyone benefits, they don't. There are winners and there are losers for trade. So one of the most important things I think we have to do is acknowledge the history of that visible hand throughout our entire history. But the realization, too, that we are going to trade. We have a de facto integrated global economy, but we have to sort out the particular terms of this trade, the context. Way back in the day, and this is for the Lowell folks that are funding this thing, was teaching at University of Lowell, University of Massachusetts up at Lowell. Phil Moss, Bill Lazonic, Chris Tilley, the Center for Industrial Competitiveness, okay, CIC. And this was about industrial policy. The idea that as far as outsourcing and opening up your economy entirely, that's not wise, because you still have to start thinking about employment and incomes when it comes to your domestic economy. If you can't maintain, and especially Ohio, the Rust Belt, et cetera, those people, what are they going to do? And you give an ideology, well, we'll outsource it and give you a better job. That is hollow words. People are hurting, and once again, a demagogue says, who can do this? Now, talking about the specifics of the most recent type of things, there was claims that who needs to pay taxes? Because you can just simply let those foreigners beggar the neighbor. So the globe will now pay our taxes, we don't have to pay income taxes, et cetera, it's a win-win. Wow. Now, I was talking to the delightful Jill Crowley earlier today, and I said, how am I going to get through this without ad hominem references to the person making this claim? Do you know how difficult that is? Okay? I'm doing a pretty damn good job avoiding the ad hominem, all right? But even from the Wall Street Journal across the thing, the idea of these type of tariffs are madness, okay? It's madness because, of course, it's not that easy. And when you globalize these things, you suddenly are going to have, you don't have immediate substitutes domestically. If you're trying to onshore businesses, it takes an enormous amount of time to build industries, okay? And so what happens? Mexico. And also the thing is that the first thing you do is out of the box. You punch your two best friends in the face? Now what is it? It's not revenue. And it's not protection. It's a political bellicosity. And this is the third form of tariff, that it's used to say, I hate you, okay? And more importantly, too, and this is the bullying thing, is that I'm going to do this and this, and because you're a smaller economy, I'm going to make you come to my way of thinking. I checked in our finance department, the delightful Phil Ullman, who tries to hide it, but he's actually Canadian. Talked to him today, and he is, of course, just this wry grin. Anyone know why? The hockey game. Exactly. He went to bed before the double overtime, etc. Are you aware that Trump called the team? Yeah, and said, okay, guys, do it for the country. Who won? Oh, Canada. Yeah. Because, I don't know, the dude still thinks he's in The Apprentice or something, and that this is the kind of stuff. If you look at the Canadian tariffs, they're this, excluding what? Energy, crude oil. Guess where the retaliatory tariffs are coming in? And we rely heavily on that oil patch in Canada. They know how to deal with this. And the Chinese are masters. They've read Sun Tzu. They know that you don't begin a battle until it's won. You don't strike the first thing to know that you have a victory. You line it up. In 2016, the Chinese hit Trump back, and they hit him where it hurts, in the red cap territory. Agricultural subsidies and more imports. Nebraska, Iowa, corn country got clobbered. And it basically realigned the sourcing of that to some of the BRICS, like Brazil. Okay? So the idea is that to assume that you can behave like this, that you can just arbitrarily do it, it is not a good tool to use because it's ineffectual. The law of the hammer, every task has a tool. And if you're going to use tariffs, it's an imperfect tool to settle disputes. And once again, it's not about revenue, it's not about protection. It's about settling scores, real or imagined. And I'm sorry, this is not the way you should be running a country, never mind a trade policy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. So get your questions ready. Larry, I would love to ask you first. So a lot of what we heard is the intersection of economics and labor and production and politics. So we think about like the War of 1812 basically broke the Federalists, and the whole kind of northeastern political establishment collapses, except for Francis Cabot Lowell figures out like it's going to industry. Can you give us like any sort of examples or kind of trends that we can look at where economics are either dictating politics or there's kind of a groundswell, whether it's labor or small agriculture? We have the Hamiltonians and the Jeffersonians thinking about, this philosophy of political economy. Where else can we see this? Where else can we see economics driving politics?
Well, you can see it everywhere, I think. Although the question is, does economics drag politics or does politics determine economics, I think. But, I mean, in the early republic, the trope that everyone probably learns if they study any of it is the Hamiltonian manufacturers and the Jeffersonian, yeoman farmers. And, there's a lot of just pragmatism and, ultimately the Federalists in New England, I mean, they become really free traders, whereas Jefferson and the Republicans, or the Democratic Republicans, they start to become very much manufacturing supporters. And part of the reason is political, because they have a lot of support in the Mid-Atlantic, especially Pennsylvania, and the people up there who are Republicans are, mechanics, and these people who I was talking about who support protection and support developing manufacturers. And so then you have a party, I mean, it's like, the big tent in American politics. You have a party that consists of Southern planters and then Northern mechanics, who are people that we think of as being middle class or lower middle class. And so, it's an uneasy fit, but the rhetoric of protection goes a long way towards crafting that tent. So the political and the economic are always completely intertwined, I think.
And is it safe to say that a lot of this is driven by elites, by economic elites? Or
yeah, but not entirely. I mean, these mechanics are the first really promoters of protective tariffs, of protection towards manufacturers. They think of manufacturing in different terms than we think of it when we're sitting here. And that rhetoric becomes, I mean, that's also a political rhetoric, I guess. And it becomes, it's the same, but when you start talking about protecting manufacturing in, say, 1825, you're saying something very different, really, than you were saying in 1795. But it's a political movement, and in some ways it co-opts the bottom-up protectionist movement that you have early on.
And I heard from both of you, and maybe Brian, you can speak to this idea of value added. And so one of the things that makes our current administration upset with the Europeans in specific terms is the value-added tax. And what is the relationship between a value-added tax and a tariff? What's the difference? Are those two things just being completely conflated?
There are two forms of taxes. And value-added, of course, are not at the port. It's domestic. And the idea, and the Canadians, if you ever head to Montreal and try to buy a pack of ciggies, you know what I'm talking about. The value-added tax is a lovely little tax that is used as a revenue source. So they're a bit different because it's explicitly a revenue. There's nothing about protection or anything. It is simply a way of revenue. And I mentioned the cigarettes because you tend to things like sin taxes, that you do that full revenue on things that you're trying to avoid. You change the relative price of something in order to be able to reallocate it as such. Remember, tariffs are taxes. And if you want to really understand the power relationships within any economy at any particular period of time, look at the structure of the tax system. Look at who pays taxes and who doesn't pay taxes. That is, in a real time, a snapshot of the power relationship. That it changes over time. And you see right now the situation where we asked about elites, et cetera. But it's a very interesting thing. Right now, we're in a really weird place as far as looking at these tariffs and looking at the relationship and the world. Because the question is a lot of interests that are powerful aren't as powerful as they were, and new ones are pushing their way to the top. And so we're seeing actually a really weird changing of the guard as far as in the United States, as far as corporate power, of who is calling the shots and who is getting their interests protected as such. Okay.
And I'll ask Larry one more question before I walk into the audience and take some questions. So here we're on the site of Francis Cabot Lowell's textile mill, and Lowell goes to Washington, D.C. in 1816 and is arguing for the Tariff of 1816, primarily to protect cotton and the cotton industry. Is that a common thing that we see single industry tariff lobbying efforts, or is this kind of a broad-based manufacturing push?
Well, it's extremely common. I mean, the wool industry, the wool growers hold these huge conventions, and they're trying to protect wool. And you have this odd situation in Louisiana, actually, where the sugar growers get a sugar tariff. I mean, they're the only protectionist people in the South. So that is very common. But they try to make this argument. The Whig Party ultimately becomes the heirs to this. Early on, political economists like Matthew Carey, who I've written up quite a bit about, are arguing that there's a harmony of interests, so that the manufacturers get protection, and that benefits agriculture, because the agricultural products will have an outlet, although they already really have one in England. And so everything is, it's a beautiful clockwork mechanism, and everyone benefits from the system.
How many questions? By the way, half this city is Canadian descent, so there were no boos going on last night, at least the south side. So when did subsidies become a thing, and were they used to fix the damage from over tariffs and just, because there's so many commodities that we had to buy or business had to consume, but with value-added products, it's an optional purchase. And I would think that at some point that lever kind of turns a little. And when did subsidies become a thing to fix the damage of those kind of commodity markets?
First off, look at the colonial state. This is a really small, and we are a really weak central state. You don't have the ability to do that. You don't have the revenues, you don't have the mechanisms to even do this. So we're talking a substantial increase in the size of the state. This is going to be coming out of First World War, Second War, et cetera. Now immediately it comes with the provisioning for warfare, that you can start certain industries being able to do that as far as maintaining levels of demand as such. But then it starts to really take off after the end of the Second World War. The idea is to then make sure that certain industries get consistent levels of aggregate demand, with the state filling in underneath to ensure that it's able to produce as such. Of recent, it was the Europeans that started, significant with agriculture, but we do the same thing too. If you take a look at American agriculture, it is significantly based in subsidies, et cetera. And this just became a de facto way of making it profitable. The last 2 or 3 farm bills are designed to produce surpluses. And we kind of will patriotically dump them on our neighbors or whoever would take them as such. But it's designed for overproduction, because it's a net subsidy to how those people with the red hats that vote in Nebraska and Iowa, to keep those prices up and to keep that going. So there's a political side of this thing. It's definitely, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, but you have to have a large state with a capacity to engage in those subsidies. And so we're powerful as far as that ability to do so, but this is a relatively recent thing, post-Second World War.
Thank you both. That's really a fantastic presentation. I'm going to try to sneak 2 questions in here real quick. So first for Professor Peskin, on the historical side, I understand that, if I remember correctly, in the late 1800s to the 1913s, the federal government was actually generating anywhere between 50 to 90% of its revenue through the tariff mechanism until it switched over to the income tax. So when they switched over to income tax and do away with the tariff, was that done unilaterally by themselves, or they were having this cooperation with other powers? And then for Professor Snyder, the current tariff proposal could be rational, illogical, based on many reasons you proposed, but it doesn't mean in reality it doesn't happen, because he has many different goals. So one of the main goals that he has right now is really to pass the tax cut that was done in 2016 and make it permanent, and be able to convince about 40 members of the Freedom Caucus who want to cut deficits, right? They will have to fill the gap of the hole, and tariff could be pitched as this back to the future revenue generator.
Magic revenue.
So in your case, would that make that saying, at least in the short term, I don't call it a solution, a logical conclusion to what he will do? I'll stop here. Thank you.
Well, yeah, as far as the 20th century, I mean, you're getting a little out of my, expertise, but, the income tax was a progressive movement. I mean, like the progressive with a capital P, the, Progressive Party, the Progressive Democrats and Progressive Republicans. And, the tariff is a very regressive tax. I mean, it hits the poor. It hits them almost as much as anybody else, as long as you consume stuff. So the idea was, of course, that the income tax would be a much more progressive tax in the lowercase p sense, in that the poor would pay a smaller amount and wealthier people would pay more. So that's something to think about perhaps today. But yeah.
They're going to pass that tax cut. And the reason is that it is basically what is payment for services rendered as far as the political cycle. And they really don't care about funding it. Because what was that thing? What's it? Tariffs are for, no, was it deficits are for the little people? Deficits are for suckers. And the thing is that you can walk away from that, you can blame it on somebody else. He's got this propensity to blame people. I don't know if you caught this. He blames people. So said that obviously that deficit will be Biden, clearly. So they will pass it, but they're in real time and real terms not going to be funding it as revenue neutral. And the poor Republicans who have to stand up there and start asking, is this revenue neutral? They're going to get from the various folks that are going to shoot them down, because there's a lot of magical thinking when it comes to budgets and revenue with these folks.
Hi. So I have two questions. One is, because of the current economy that we have, that we depend so much on imports, I guess in my opinion, we're not ready really to have tariffs and promote our local manufacturing, because we just don't have it. So it seems to me like it's a recipe for disaster, basically, because we're going to have a tax for everybody, because we don't have the products to substitute whatever we are pouring tariffs on. My question is basically, what do you think about that, and what do you think will happen? Because no matter what the president says, at some point it's going to hurt us, so he probably will have to backtrack and say, okay, instead of 25%, maybe it will be 10 or something like that. So I imagine that it will sort of settle. So my question is, what do you think will happen with the situation we have right now, about the tariffs and how it will affect people, et cetera? And also, what do you think about the Jones Act, that in my opinion is an implied tariff on Hawaii, Alaska, Puerto Rico, and other colonies? So what do you think about those two?
There is no, when you slap those tariffs on, and the most beautiful thing to see is how quickly they peeled back and delayed the tariff on Mexico, the 25% on agricultural goods. Because somebody had the sense, and it took a lot of courage to come up and whisper into his ear, please don't do this. Because timing is everything, like a tax. The timing of the tariff and the target. Where do you think your vegetables come from? Your fruit. This is the worst possible time to slap a tariff on the Mexicans on this material, because it's going to be immediately inflationary at the grocery store. You have problems with eggs? Read my avocado, okay? Because immediately it's purely inflationary, because you can't substitute the bloody thing, okay? So in the short run, and you're right, and then when it comes to industrial policy, as I mentioned before, you can't quickly onshore industries that have been offshored, because it's not just the industry, it's the supporting intermediate goods that are around that industry that have been destroyed too. This takes decades to put this together. This is why I do industrial policy, Because the real destruction is not the specific industry, it's the feeder industries that cluster around it, the agglomeration economies as such. That's where the employment and incomes happen. Once they go, it takes decades to bring them back. And once again, you saw what happened with the microchip industry. We offshored and said, oh yeah, just-in-time production, globalization, everyone wins and we can capture efficiencies. But now they spend billions of dollars to try and onshore a chip industry because they, strategically realize, okay, this is a problem. When you have to push your F-150 pickup trucks off the assembly line because you don't have a chip for it, you got a problem, Houston. So yeah, this is, once again, globalization, that high water mark and retreating, this is now the chickens coming home to roost from that.
To your point, last night I saw the result of 6 major polls, reputable, Harris, Gallup, et cetera. And the tariffs across the board with Americans are hugely unpopular. And I was surprised. I went to exactly where you went, which is in the context of the price of eggs. And for some reason, they must have understood, people understand $4,000 extra on a car, and the avocados, et cetera. So in the context of what's been happening with inflation, as you said, I think it resonates, and the American public, to my surprise, really absorbed the data and the numbers and believed it. It's also within the context of all of the administration's policies of the last month, one by one, pretty unpopular, but tariffs by far a huge margin.
I think that people have kind of figured this out. Where the heck do your strawberries come from? It's not rocket science. And once again, why would you pick on Canadians? They're nice. Eh? Yeah, and it's just like, my God, you don't punch your friends in the face right out of the block. It makes no sense. So this is, I guess, a governing style to kind of bully people, to show that the kowtow, get those early wins on the weak ones. But try telling Canadians they're weak. They're nice, but the most beautiful things is the unification of Canada, because they are coming together. Even those restive Western provinces, that oil patch, etc., they go, screw this. The beautiful thing, too, is that if you want to play this game, it's oil. And they are going to, hydrocarbon, they're going to turn it right off. We'll play this game because you can't, you specifically avoid that. You think that Canada's going to play along. They learn from the Chinese, hit them where it hurts, and it's going to be energy.
All roads lead to energy.
You go figure, the hydrocarbon economy. Yes.
I have a complicated question.
Complex,
Yes,
go.
yes. And by no means do I support anything, any party or anything. Aloof of that. But I understand the fact clearly of this, the behavior of the current government, which you have very adeptly described as a bullish behavior. I think that's what it is. It's settling scores. However, my problem is with globalization, and it's like hitting yourself in the foot, which we did. So someone who might not understand economics to such an extent, because he's a finance person, not an econ person, and so that's why these policies, these tax breaks concepts of, like what the other person also said, was that if we reduce, like if these tariffs come in the short term, could they help? But the money doesn't go in production, it goes into the finance, and it again is for the bubbles and stuff. So I get that's wrong doing that. But who was doing it? Like, at least someone's now focusing on, the approach is entirely wrong, but someone's focusing on actually working on production now. I know it's a democratic area, and I've said I'm bipartisan of anything, but like thoroughly disappointed in the previous, economic situations, thoroughly. And as someone who enjoys the understanding of economics, my question is, what is the solution? What is the solution to, because I understand this tariff shit, it's okay, it's not prudent, right? But what do you do? Like, if you don't do that, you're gonna go out and globalize it because the business people wanna make money and they're greedy people. That's why they're going there. The financialization, I have a big problem with, not with business finance, but financialization, and that's what they're doing. So once you had an incompetent business government, and now you have one that's focused on finance, however, focusing on bringing in production here. So what is the solution for it?
The point that he's making that is really, really important is there has been a major transformation in the structure of this economy. This is truly a financialized economy. We don't make stuff, we don't make goods and services. The wealth is being made in the flipping of assets, the bundling of assets, and the originating of financial securities as such. There's a problem with that when you have a small amount of financialization on a stream of production, of actual value, which creates employment and incomes and drives your local economy. But when that flips into just paper assets with no production or value behind it, there's a huge amount of error in this. And unfortunately, we're in a very precarious position going forward that all of this error that you see within our valuation, that everything now is chasing, turned into a financial asset. Not as a problem as far as generating employment and incomes, but it's highly unstable. And we're in a position right now of fragility because of this situation. Financialization is highly unstable. Oh my God. Yeah, Jill and I are looking at islands off the coast of Maine right now, so.
Actually, I was wondering about this. When you're talking about tariffs, it's very, there's the economic argument against tariffs, but the idea that a lot of production has moved to different countries because of globalization, and there's like a national security issue about having tariffs because there are certain things that ought to be produced in this country and aren't being produced in this country. And so I think what the current administration, they have certain instincts about this problem that is really hard to define. I would say, like, for example, Japan has protection against production of rice, and people, economists tend to poo-poo that, and then they say that it's a form of protectionism, but they're worried that if there's a war or something, that their population would starve, and that's part of the reason why they have that protection for rice. And during World War II, the British relied on Argentina for a lot of their food supply, and they basically had a lot of problems because they had imported most of their food supply prior to that. And so how would you argue, I guess, how would you argue in terms of national security, in terms of having production in this country, or like when there's an actual need, or if like war comes unexpectedly, it would be even more chaotic than it would be right now.
Take the first shot, and I'll finish.
Well, I was gonna just talk about the first part of what you said, which is that globalization, it's really not new. I mean, the economy in the early 19th century was extremely global in the sense that the most valuable product in the United States was cotton, which was almost entirely sold to Great Britain, where they, turned it into textiles. Now this mill, is an example of trying to turn that tide and take stop the globalization, I guess, if you want to use the modern language, and turn it into a domestic economy. Didn't work really for a long time, but that's the idea of the early tariffs. And in fact, it does work in the late 19th century because the United States has this enormous domestic market. So you can sell these products domestically because you have all of these new states and all this new farm belt and millions of immigrants and all these new people who are able to buy it. I know that doesn't speak to the security issues. I'm sure Brian can do it. But
I got that.
So go ahead, take it away.
To paraphrase the notion that patriotism is the last refuge of a scoundrel, protectionism used to be considered the last refuge of a scoundrel. And you would see members of the House come forward, because remember, this is what you do. You protect your peeps at home. This is your district. You bring home the bacon by protecting domestically. This is why the power of the purse is with Congress, because you have the direct exposure to people at home. So if you got no other argument about why they should protect that industry, you went national security. Now, traditionally, they were lousy arguments. But with that said, dial it back a bit. You don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. With globalization, you know the concept of just-in-time production. This is efficiency. The Japanese learned that you don't carry inventories when you have a cyclical economy because you're going to eat those. You're going to have to absolutely be nimble so that you have just-in-time production. But this assumes that your supply chain will always be available. Hello, pandemic. This is exactly what happens. You need that little bit of buffer. And even though I would counsel to resist those claims on national security, we've seen, back to the F-150 and the chip, there are certain things you better make sure are going to be around just in case if things go south. You don't have to get biblical, like how many 12 years of grain or whatever.
Well, but I think it's also worth adding that the British were incredibly concerned about what we would call national security in terms of their textile manufacturing, and this mill is is evidence number one that did not work very well. And if it didn't work in 1814, it's hard to imagine that we're going to protect proprietary chips in 2025.
By the way, I hope you guys appreciate the crash of the NVIDIA stock as opposed to that. Oh, God, I love it.
After the War of 1812, England began to dump all the textiles here in New England, and all over New England, manufacturers closed down, but this mill survived. Was it the Tariff of 1816 that caused it to survive? And would the mill have closed down without the tariff? Because Waltham had a similar thing after World War II with the Swiss watches flooding the market. They dumped the watches. Switzerland was a neutral country, and the Waltham mayor and a delegation from Hamilton and Elgin went to Washington and pleaded with the president, President Truman at the time, for tariffs, and he refused. And one by one, the American watch manufacturers closed down, which did hurt national security. So my question is, would this mill have survived without the tariff of 1816? Because at the time, it was just two little bit, not small, but two mills down at the other end of the complex.
I mean, that was the argument that they made, and it was a disaster for manufacturing. 1820 was really the nadir of early manufacturing, and the tariff movement was built on that concern. They bailed in 1820. There was a protective tariff that didn't come to be. I mean, I think probably economy of scale had something to do with the success of the Lowell mills, but it's not an easy question.
Hi. First of all, thank you guys so much, and good to see you again, Professor Snyder. Two things came to mind while you were talking that I want to ask about. I've just returned from 5 months abroad in Shanghai, China.
Good.
The first thing is any stores that I would go to buy steaks, to buy any type of beef, I noticed that it was all from Inner Mongolia, Brazil, and Argentina, and was significantly higher than the pork and the chicken. So I definitely saw the results of what you're speaking of.
Exactly.
The second thing, though, was I was very impressed with how developed a lot of the economy and the industry is there, namely the electric vehicle industry. And the electric vehicles in China, I was talking to someone who told me 80% of the new cars on the road in the city of in Shanghai are electric vehicles. And they're incredibly advanced, companies that most Americans have never heard of making really, really advanced cars. As a guy who loves American cars and is very into, all of that, I just do not see a world where America in the near future competes in that space. And if automobiles are going to continue to be desirable as electric vehicles, how would you walk me through why a tariff is not necessary in that situation?
Well, I think the tariff is a sign of weakness. They benefit weak countries, as Brian said, and we're a weak country now in terms of auto manufacturing. So we're maybe the perfect people in a way to have an automobile tariff.
And just realpolitik, that when it comes to the actual tariffs on China, we were talking at 10%, and they were talking a little bit about steel, a little bit about aluminum, but that's sort of nefarious out there. But when you take a look at actually President Musk, and you realize the stake he has in the Chinese EV market, see where we're going with this? That you can talk all you want, but when it comes to making tariffs stick, it ultimately is the bottom line. The bottom line is the Chinese have played this rather well. And when you can have someone as powerful as Musk basically calling the shots, the Chinese won this without firing a shot.
What does that mean?
It means that you can talk about tariffs, but it's not going to happen because he's protecting his own interest. There's a reason he's in China, because he's playing in that market, and also that you will not get tariffs accordingly. Shoot.
Would you agree that this would be a necessary circumstance with tariffs?
For the EV market, if you are going to be looking at long-term, and we're talking about the kind of subsidies to really destroy the hydrocarbon industry in this country, which also has a piece of this administration. I'm not sure how you're going to nuance it, because obviously you got to keep President Musk happy, and at the same time, you also have to keep the hydrocarbon industry in business. So it's going to be an interesting thing. If it's going to be any sort of a tariff, it might be, I'll call it relatively symbolic, as opposed to really hurting or sticking. Now remember too that these tariffs don't happen in a vacuum. You do it and you can immediately expect a response. The Canadians and Mexicans they know about this stuff, and the Chinese are old hands. So the idea, the immediate thing is if you actually land a punch with a tariff, you can expect a counterpunch of equal or greater proportion. And so I don't know if we really want to start any sort of a thing with electric vehicles as such, but as far as capacity, the Chinese are massively ramping up as far as EV production. And this is out of necessity. Try breathing in Beijing. Mm-hmm.
Last question?
Shoot.
Yes, I just want to ask about tariffs and trade and sustainability.
A little louder, Krishna. Louder.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk about the tariffs and trade and sustainability aspect of it. So I know you talked about how subsidies and tariffs lead to more, higher crop yields and more surpluses, and they're dumping that on other markets.
Yeah.
And then globalization itself, there's a trade in trash as well, and a lot of more developed countries trade trash, and that trash goes to lower developed countries. Mm-hmm. So I kind of want to ask, where's the middle ground between globalization and tariffs that would be the most sustainable?
And it's dealing with kind of the global market in the export of waste you were talking about, like trash, et cetera. Well, what happens when a country develops, look at China. We used to ship tremendous amounts of plastic and waste to the Chinese to be processed, et cetera. But they reached a tipping point where that's no longer the case because you don't have to do it. We're wealthy enough, we don't have to do that. We had to do it for primitive accumulation to get our industries up, but you develop out of that particular rung. Look at countries that are significantly below her, and they become the pollution havens as far as sending trash to them. I would probably take a look at places like Indonesia, but I don't think the Indonesians would appreciate us adding to their difficulties. Remember India, too. I mean, the coast of India, as far as scrapping ships, entirely toxic areas dealing with merchant marine fleets and cutting them up, et cetera. they have a toxic legacy. But as they get wealthier too, it's the environmental Lorenz curve, that they will start realizing that they have to breathe and they have to have potable water, and that keeping their kids from dying of horrible diseases is probably a good thing. So I think that one of the functions of development itself is learning to say no when it comes to taking toxic waste from developed countries.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thanks for coming out.
Yeah.
Thank you to Professors Snyder and Peskin for joining us tonight. And please come back to the museum, learn where it all began, for instance, Cabot Lowell in 1813. Have a great night. Thank you.